Okay, Chevra. Good morning, everyone. Just before we go into some more of the text, I wanted to share with you an article that was written a few years ago on a website called jlaw.com. I actually think this is a very good website. It has some very valuable documents. It hasn't been updated in as far as its graphic interface in quite some time. But this article is from 1997. And the reason why it caught my eye is because it was written by someone having to do with Toronto. Okay, so here's the article. A woman in Toronto recently told me a story. She had gone shopping for children's clothes in a basement boutique. Before making her purchase, she repeatedly asked the saleswoman if the price included sales tax. Yes, it does, she was told. Still suspicious, she asked the saleswoman for a receipt. Oh, if you want a receipt, then I'll have to charge you more, the saleswoman replied. As it happens, sales receipts do not generally cost extra in Canada, but printing a receipt does create a record of the sale, a record that could come to the attention of local tax authorities. Also, it happens both of the people in the story were Orthodox Jews. In communities all over the world, there's an attitude among some Orthodox Jews that not paying taxes, whether sales tax or income tax, is acceptable. The phenomenon takes many forms. Merchants who do not charge sales tax, customers who agree to pay cash for goods or services, individuals who understate their income on their income tax returns. Even many people who would not personally cheat the tax authorities seem most tolerant of those who do. They make no criticism of such behavior among their friends, relatives, and neighbors, and in many cases, willingly patronize businesses which flout the tax laws. Nor does one hear loud condemnation of this problem from the leadership of our community. Yet cheating on taxes violates halacha, violates secular law, and creates a prodigious chilul Hashem. Those who do not cheat, but make it possible for others to evade tax, violate the prohibition of lifnei iver, enabling another to sin. And then after he gives that introduction, he goes into the sources, which you and I have been studying. So he goes into a number of the sources, and then he concludes with the moral issues. In addition to arguments rooted in Jewish and secular law, paying taxes represents a moral obligation. The Torah commands us to be a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This mandate requires avoiding any kind of dishonesty, certainly financial dishonesty. The Torah tells us that maintaining false weights and measures is a toeva, an abomination. As the Sefer HaChinuch writes, the rationale for the mitzvah of honesty and distancing oneself from theft and deceit among human beings is known by every person of intelligence. Indeed, according to Rav Shamshin Raphael Hirsch, the sin of Hamas, for which the generation of the flood were destroyed, was underhanded dealing by cunning, astute dishonesty. Finally, there is the issue of Chilul Hashem. The Torah explicitly prohibits desecrating the name of God, and the halacha states that dishonesty in business constitutes a Chilul Hashem. In fact, theft from a Gentile is actually worse than theft from a Jew because it causes a Chilul Hashem. The Talmud Yerushalmi recounts that Rabban Gamliel prohibited stealing from a Gentile specifically because of Chilul Hashem. Similarly, according to Tosfos, there is no dispute that robbing from a Gentile is prohibited where it will cause a Chilul Hashem. Halachically speaking, there is no question about the permissibility of the evasion of taxes. Tax evasion is both a sin and a crime. It violates numerous biblical prohibitions, including that of Chilul Hashem. In addition to active tax evasion, halacha prohibits enabling others to commit the transgression. These rules unquestionably apply in the United States and most Western countries, where the tax system is administered in an even-handed and objective fashion. And if you'll recall, that was one of the distinctions that the Rav Shulchan Aruch had brought from the Shulchan Aruch, which is that when the tax collector is the sheriff of Nottingham and is doing aggressive and abusive tax collection, then there's something to talk about. But like he says, the tax system in Western countries is administered in an even-handed and objective fashion. Therefore, the halachic community must not and cannot tolerate the continued evasion of taxes in our midst. If one would not patronize a restaurant owned by a religious Jew who serves non-kosher food, then one should not patronize a store owned by a religious Jew who cheats on his taxes. Even paying cash for an item is forbidden where circumstances suggest that the purchase will not be reported to the appropriate tax authorities. Now, that sentence in and of itself is a bit controversial, but there's definitely, I think you can all appreciate the rationale. What he's basically saying is that you're enabling someone to commit an act of stealing. If you know that by you're paying cash, you're enabling that person to not pay tax on it, then you're complicit in that tax evasion. Even paying cash for an item is forbidden where circumstances suggest that the purchase will not be reported to the appropriate tax authority. Nor is tax evasion justified by a motive to dedicate the extra money to a mitzvah, such as tzedakah or supporting Talmud Torah. As is well known, the Torah invalidated the mitzvah haba be'avera, the mitzvah that is brought about by a transgression. The Torah demands absolute integrity in business matters. According to the Gemara, when we face divine judgment after we die, we are asked a series of questions about how we lived our earthly lives. For example, we are asked, Kavati itim la Torah, did you establish time for Torah study? Tzipita li Yeshua, did you anticipate the redemption? It seems fair to assume that the questions are ranked in order of importance. Yet the first question is not about Torah study or awaiting the coming of Messiah. The first question we are asked by the divine judge is, Nasata v'natata be'amuna, did you conduct business honestly? All right, so this, the author is Ellie Clark Esquire. Does anyone know who that is? Sounds like a Toronto person based on the way that he wrote. And it sounds like he was familiar with what goes on in the Orthodox community in Toronto. I must confess that when I first came here and I saw people committing this practice, I figured, I thought that since it was so widespread in the community, perhaps there was some rationale to permit it here. But I finally realized that that the author of this article, as well as what we've seen in halacha, is correct. Even if a service provider gives you the option of paying cash and not paying HST, that does not give you the halachic right to do that. Both you are committing gezela, you're committing theft, and you're enabling, I mean, it's arguable whether you're committing theft because you're paying whatever the service provider tells you to pay. It's really his obligation to pay the tax. And if he evades paying the tax, then he's the one who's guilty of gezela. But what you are complicit in is you're helping him, you're aiding and abetting him commit an act of gezela. And the potential chilul Hashem is always there. There are some people who have gotten away with running their businesses this way for decades, but that doesn't mean that that they're going to get away with it next time. That when you are their customer. Okay, so that's why whenever I am offered by an Orthodox Jew the option to pay cash, I always say no. I'd rather pay credit, or I'd rather pay with a check. And he says, well, I'll have to charge you HST. I said, well, I want to pay HST. That's my obligation as a subject of this country. I moved here because I wanted to obey the laws. And one of my obligations is to pay tax. I benefit from the government services. And by the way, I've heard the argument that, well, I already pay enough taxes. So I don't need to pay sales tax because I pay a heck of a lot of taxes. I get taxes removed from my paycheck every month. So I pay plenty of taxes, and there's so much tax fraud. Why shouldn't I be a part of it also? There's some, like for example, people who say that that OHIP is so abused And that's why Ontario has to charge so many taxes, because there's so much fraud by people who come into the country who aren't really legal, and they benefit from the medical system, and they're draining the resources from the medical system. So that in itself is basis enough for me to not have to pay HST, because it's just going to go to people who aren't entitled to it. So anyway, these are all rationales. If you want the article here, what I'll do is I'll place it in the chat for today so that you can. Let's see here. There we go. So does everyone see it in the chat? It's www.jlaw.com/commentary/payingtaxes.html. Okay.
Rabbi, just getting back to my question from a previous class about small services that many of us use. For example, like when I mentioned the cleaning lady that comes, I've never heard of anybody paying HST on their to their cleaning lady who comes once a week or once every 2 weeks or whatever it may be.
I know, and she probably wouldn't even know how to collect HST. I agree with you that this is an issue where I don't have a complete solution for. In other words, I think what your point is that on some level, all of us on some level are guilty at some point of not paying taxes on some level. And that's true. The only defense that I can give is that if a practice is so widespread that the government looks the other way, then it's almost a tacit acknowledgement from the government that you're exempt from this kind of tax, because everyone or many people have housekeepers that they pay in this way too. That's the only thing that I can suggest. And I confess that I'm guilty of it, because I've never asked my housekeeper to give me a form and to pay HST on it. But we pay her an hourly wage. Now, is she obligated to pay tax on that? Yes, she is. I have no idea whether she does or not. I can't tell you one way or the other. But it's not something that I remember years ago in the US, there was a woman who was a nominee for a certain political office, and she did not pass muster with the public opinion because it was discovered that she had domestic household help that was an illegal alien. In California, people not only pay cash for their domestic help, but they will also hire undocumented workers. It doesn't happen as much here in Canada because it's very difficult for a person to be undocumented here. But although it does happen to one degree or another, but there are certain people who, it's almost universal that people hire, a housekeeper who is not documented. So anyway, I don't know what to tell you. It's just it's a common practice.
Rabbi, it's Shmuel. A lot of these domestic housekeepers, they may not even be required to collect HST. There's a rule here that if their total sales are less than 30,000, they don't have to register for HST. Income tax is a different story.
I see. All right. Well, that's certainly consoling as far as how you can justify the practice. So, okay, that's certainly helpful. Let me share with you something else. This is an old friend of mine. His name is Ari Wasserman, and he. Let's see if I can share this with you. He wrote a series of books called Hegyonei HaParsha, which deal with. Hold on a second, guys. I got to visit an unwelcome visitor. Okay, sorry about that. So this is called Hegyonei HaParsha, and he goes through different issues of halacha. And he's got one essay called Tashlum Misim B'Yameinu B'Chutz La'aretz U'Ve'eretz Yisrael. Paying taxes nowadays, both in outside of Eretz Yisrael and inside of Eretz Yisrael. Can everyone see what I've put up on the screen? Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're not going to deal with the issue of Dina de Malchuta Dina in the land of Israel today. I know that Wayne is on the call. So Wayne, you've probably heard perhaps that there have been poskim who have suggested that the law of Dina de Malchuta Dina has a different status in the land of Israel. We're not going to deal with that today. Suffice it to say that if someone were to ask me the question, do I have to pay my taxes in Israel? I would say there's no difference between paying taxes in Israel and paying taxes in Chutz La'aretz. But it's an interesting discussion, which we won't be touching upon. But in this particular essay, we'll just touch on the issue of Chovat Tashlum Misim B'Chutz La'aretz B'Yameinu, the obligation to pay taxes in the diaspora in foreign countries in our lifetime. He says, Bishut Igrot Moshe, in the responsa of the Igros Moshe, that's Rav Moshe Feinstein, B'ma'aneh l'talmid asher nisa'oli bo lashuv b'teshuva. This was a student who asked a series of questions involving stealing. And he was asking because he wanted to do tshuva. He had stolen from parents, he had stolen from this person, that person, and he had evaded paying taxes. And that was one of his questions. V'ritzono leida, eich lekayim mitzvahs hashava b'ginevas mamon shenasa al yidei havrachas meches ba'arama mitashlume telephone, the subway, uchedome. So he wanted to know how he could fulfill paying back his taxes that he had evaded paying using different kinds of subterfuge when it came to paying his telephone bill and his subway obligations, because I guess maybe he jumped the turnstile. Who knows what he did? So Heishiv the Vadai Tzarich Teshuva al Zev ulehizaher shelo lasos od. And he said that you certainly have to be careful never to do it again. And anything that any objects that you have in your possession that are the result of those ill-gotten gains, you have to return. The ifsekain barambam shekasavim gazlo oshko yachzerayin sham v'chein b'shulchan aruch. So this is clearly paskin that if you have objects, actual physical objects that you've stolen, those have to certainly be returned. And that's how you would do tshuva. Vim einam be'en, but if they're no longer, if there's nothing physically in your house, it's just that you've not paid taxes. Al yidei ones, histapek bigros moshem yeshdin tashlum. He says, so the Rav Moshe deliberates, he's not sure whether there's any obligation to actually pay your back taxes that you haven't paid. But he did write that it's proper that if you know that there's certain amounts that you haven't paid, that you should try your best to make good on it. The kol shekain be'enam be'en be'ived biyadayim shetzarach lahachmir adkan. He says, and certainly, he's talking about things that you may have stolen. He says, but when things, if it's just money, and the money is not intact anymore, if you have squandered it and spent it, and you've taken it away from other people, then certainly you should be machmir. So Rav Moshe is quite clear that in the United States you're not allowed to evade your taxes. And Bishut Shevet Halevi Nishal Be'echad She'ovid B'Misrad HaMeches Be'artzot HaBrit. And Rav, this is Rav, I believe Rav Vosner, the Shevet Halevi, and he's asked the following question. Someone works in an office, b'misrad hameches, in the tax office in the U.S., meaning that he works for the IRS. Ucheshehu roa mi sherima et hamemshala tzarich limsor oto beveit hamishpat. So his job is to note that when someone has committed fraud on their tax returns and they have lied about their taxes, if he discovers that, he has to report this person. Uritzono lodas imhu begeder malshin odina de malchusadina. And he asks the Rav, am I allowed to do this? Am I a malshin? Am I a moser? Am I giving over a Jew to the secular courts for punishment when I'm not allowed to? Do I have to abide by the law? The tshuvaso kasav shebe'etzim din meches less din v'less dayin sheze nichnas begerer dina de malchusadina ve'in kan din moiser. So Rav Vosner responds. He says, "There's no question that paying taxes falls under the rubric of dina de malchusadina, that you must obey the law. There's no problem if that's your job to report this person. Ela de lechatchila kedai shelo lekabel mishra kazot. But it's better not to have such a job. In other words, if you're given an opportunity to be transferred to another department, that would certainly be better than spending your day reporting your fellow Jew for committing tax fraud." Okay. Urei bedarchei mishpat b'memshalot dechutz la'aretz dinei hamemshala din afal pi she'in sham melech ela rosh memshala hanibcher lekama shanim. He says it's clear also that it makes no difference whether the government is a monarchy or whether it's a democracy. You still have to follow the law of the land. So therefore, you're not allowed to evade your taxes. V'sham bi'er, the afal pisha b'malchuyos af de kaimelan da'asur lahavriach, yesh rishonim she'itiru lahavriach mechas mishum delo havi le ela hafkas halvaz goy demuteres. He says in that sefer, he notes that there are rishonim. This is not what we learned in the we saw this in the Ramah. The Ramah brings a more lenient position than the opinion of the Machaber and the Rambam. The Rambam says it's outright gezela. And then we saw the Ramah temper it somewhat. In other words, the language was that maybe it's not gezela because you're simply not paying that which you owe to a Gentile, which is a different rubric of halacha. It may only constitute chilul Hashem, but does not constitute actual theft. Mikol makom yesh lomar b'memshalot hanehugot kayom hakamot al yedei b'chirat rov hatoshavim kuli alma modu da'asr. But that might only be true, the Sefer writes, based on the fact that it's a monarchy, that it's an imposed government. But today, when you have a democratically elected government, where every citizen gets to choose democratically who will be their next political leader, then everyone would agree that it's a form of theft, because you can no longer argue that you're simply not paying back a debt that is imposed upon you by some entity, by some royal entity. This is a democratically elected person who says you have to pay your taxes. And so we've all of the citizens by consensus have agreed to do this. And by my not participating in that, that might actually be worse in a democracy than in a monarchy. Now, for fairness, we're going to learn those opinions who are not as stringent as what we've seen so far. And he says, Savara she'ein isur lahavriach. He says, Midivrei Rashi v'Harash, shekasvu lahavriach hameches avika havkas halva'aso. There is an opinion from certain Rishonim that not paying taxes is really just failure to pay back a debt, which we said that for a Gentile can sometimes be justified. Muvur shahavrachas hamechas muteres afilu mehamelech atzmo b'deleka chilul Hashem ve'eno over b'zeh mishum gezela. So it becomes clear that according to that opinion in the Rishonim, in the medievalists, it's not actual gezela. The only issue that's left to contend with is the Chilul Hashem aspect. V'chein al perish haran, the havracha samechas mimelech goy atzma muter mitam delo yehi ela halva'aso, muvur shekol zman shein Chilul Hashem ein isur lahavriach mehamechas. So it becomes clear, according to this secondary opinion, that any time that you are simply failing to pay that which you owe to the government, that's called hafkas halva, not paying back a debt, and it does not constitute gezela according to this opinion. So, based on that, b'tshuvas v'hanhagos, Rav Sternbach in his Sefer Tshuvas v'hanhagos, nishal b'davar hitchamkut mimisei hamemshala b'chutz la'aretz im over bazeh al halacha shel dina de malchus adina osh al iser gezel. So he was asked by a person who, wanted to know, is there a violation of Dina de Malchus Dina or Gezel by not paying taxes in the diaspora? V'hashoel hiftzir ma'od sheyashiv lo al kach, and the questioner writes forcefully, puts pressure on Rav Sternbach to answer the question. V'hatshuvos v'hanhagos atzmo hizbir. So Rav Sternbach himself explained, Sherabbanei Yisrael lo nahagu lomar bazeh de'ah, that rabbinical leaders in the diaspora traditionally have not expressed their views on this matter. Lo lahatir b'chshash gezel v'dina de malchusa, they have not offered a heter to evade paying taxes because they're concerned that it may constitute gezel and a violation of dina de malchusa. V'lo l'shamesh k'shotrim u'mochsim v'le'esah. But they also do not want to appear as overbearing tax collectors on behalf of the government, and they have not come out publicly to tell people that it's usher to evade paying taxes. Rak al zeh lo onim. And Rav Sternbach therefore says, we generally are silent on the matter, and we don't say a word. Rak mazhirim ma'od she'al kol panim b'makom sheyesh chashash sheyitkale v'yechilul Hashem ein avon kamohu. But what Rabbanim do say and have an obligation to point out is that regardless of whether you hold that it's gezel or not, they are very exhortative to their communities that you must be very careful, that because if it is ever discovered that there's widespread tax evasion within the Jewish community, it will be a Chilul Hashem, which is, and there's no greater sin than creating a Chilul Hashem. The alul ulai laharviach kan. Aval yad Hashem b'chol haaretz u'mafsid l'lo safek kenegdo b'mokom acher. One second. What is he saying? I'm not sure what he means to say the alulu laila harviach kan, but maybe what he's saying is that you might end up making a profit by not paying your taxes, but God's hand is everywhere. Even if you end up saving money by not paying your taxes, ultimately Hashem runs the world and he'll cause you to lose money somewhere else. I think that's what he means to say. V'gamhu lo ba lahachriya bazeh klal. But then Rav Sternbach declines to really give a conclusive answer. But based on what he just wrote, he says, look, I can't tell you definitively that it's actual gezel because of the other Rishonim that are quoted by the Ramah. I cannot tell you that it's permitted because the Rambam says it's explicitly gezel. What I can tell you is that if you do evade taxes and you end up creating a Chilul Hashem, there is no greater sin than that. And furthermore, you should realize that God controls your finances. And if you think that you're going to save money in this area, just realize that God can control your assets in some other way. But he does provide us with sort of a guideline. And he writes, and before, because we're up at the top of the hour, we'll continue this Amir Hashem tomorrow. Okay? So let me wish you a good day, and we'll finish this off Amir Hashem tomorrow. Okay?